So I finally caught a glimpse of what the FD would look like off of jack stands, and it just looks so good, and I want to keep it that way, so I got to continue working on it. And so the project for today is going to be putting steering back into the FD. The original plan was to keep the factory power steering. Now, that may end up the direction I still go with if I don't like the manual steering rack. This is just going to allow me to save a ton of time, because now I don't have to worry about rebuilding this rack, because no one makes any remanufactured racks. Mazda discontinued this part altogether. And so I decided to go with the Grannas Racing manual steering rack they offer for the FD. And this is just going to offer a lot of benefits that made me make this impulsive decision. A lot of people might complain about the fact of having manual steering in a street car. Personally, me, I've driven a lot of manual steering cars in the past. I used to have an FC as well that was manual steering from factory. And I personally enjoy it. Now, a lot of people have actually said really great things about this rack in particular, because it's a proper manual rack for the FD instead of some people that depower the factory manual rack. So it's supposed to be easier. It's going to give you really great road feel, and ultimately for spirited driving, you know, I'm going to prefer that. At least I feel like it. And ultimately, if I don't like it, then I could always end up going back, because I do have my factory rack sitting over there and I can rebuild it at any time. So I'm going to test this out, because it's going to save me about 25 pounds worth of parts. You know, you don't have the reservoir, the pump, the lines, cooler. It's also a smaller rack to begin with, and this kit allows you to clock the rack to be able to get the most amount of clearance with the steering column attached to it. And what I mean by that is this whole area right here, normally you have the steering column come through at an angle like this, but by clocking it, you can get a lower profile to allow for your exhaust to have more room. And so lots of benefits, one less point of failure, and ultimately one less thing I have to worry about in this restoration process and not building the factory rack anymore. So there's actually a couple components that we're combining between the Ronin kit, which this is the bump steer correction, and the Grannas Racing kit. And first and foremost, where the rack is going to be sitting, you're going to have these spacers which allow you to move the rack up as close to the oil pan as possible, which is going to help with correcting that bump steer. Right here is where you're going to sit your polyurethane mount. And then from there, in the bump steer correction kit, you get these brand new spindles, which allows you to place your tie rod a little bit lower. That's going to give you some adjustment to correct the bump steer up to your liking. And then what's really nice about this kit as well is normally people would do this without this spacer right here, which adds rigidity and strength to the spindle. Without it, some people might place their tie rod really low to correct their bump steer, but then over time, the amount of leverage that you would have on here would end up twisting it, and then they'd have to replace it all over again. So this is going to help out with that. So for visual representation, I've already done the driver's side, just mocking it up. I've put this to about 5 millimeters arbitrarily. I can absolutely change that later, but the idea is moving the spherical joint up and down is going to affect the amount of bump steer that you have, and ultimately you're trying to find in the area that is going to give you the minimal, if not any, bump steer at all. A lot of people don't know what bump steer is, and although I can't demonstrate it here, I'll link a video that does a really great job of showing how bad bump steer is on Mazda FDs from factory. For whatever reason, it's really bad. Anyway, so your suspension moves up and down. Ideally, on your knuckle, this is where your steering rack and pinion is going to connect to your tie rod. This is where it pulls in or out to make your wheels turn. Well, bump steer is exactly that. Whenever the wheels are bumping up and down, the steering can slightly change because of the geometry. So by placing the tie rod a little bit lower, you can correct that and have minimal turning of the wheels as your suspension is compressing up and down. This kit is actually really straightforward to put together. The instructions make it seem a little bit more complicated than what it really is, but once you actually start unbagging everything and kind of seeing where everything goes, it's super straightforward. So the main thing is you're gonna have this shim that goes on the passenger side. That allows you to get some gap that normally would be there because this side is thinner than this side. So that gives you some of that space there to clamp onto. And then on the right side, this isn't really clarified in the instructions, but this bracket, just slide it in all the way to the right side until it meets the actual steering rack. And then from there, just tighten it down. That's going to be essentially your guide for getting this one where it needs to be. The other thing that you can really see me do inside of the video is center the steering rack. So that way, whenever you turn the wheel left and right, it's going to be the same amount. So I did that, you can kind of see it in the video, but it wasn't super clear. And then finally, the bump steer correction kit. This is all eyeballed, as I mentioned. I can't really correct bump steer right now without the car essentially being finished. This is my own guess at 5mm gap here. I did this exactly the same on both sides. It was just a point of reference. I may be completely off, I don't know yet. I also threaded in the spherical joint all the way in on both sides, exactly the same amount. And then typically this leftover thread, if you have 17-inch wheels, sometimes you have clearance issues and people have to actually cut the final threads off. But everything is pretty much kind of hand tightened, maybe a little bit more snug with some hand tools. And the final fit, man, I mean, just for eyeballing it and kind of getting everything even on both sides is pretty decent. My toe's not too bad. I don't think I'm going to have to fight it much. But overall, super happy with this kit. Everything went together as planned.